Samsung Galaxy S23 Ultra is one of the most impressive camera systems we have ever seen on a smartphone. It packs a whopping 200 megapixel main sensor that shoots buttery, crispy 8K video. But is it actually any good? Today we're going to compare it side by side to this camera. This is my Sony a7S III. This camera is one of the best video cameras that you can possibly buy that fits inside of a mirrorless camera body. Obviously the most important thing is picture quality.
Alright, so kicking off, there's a static shot, and that obviously was the Sony a7S III because it's mounted on a tripod. I actually didn't have a phone attachment with me for my tripod, so I was holding it, but kind of really credit to Samsung's pretty insane stabilization systems. I mean, we'll talk about that later in the video because it's absolutely mad on the S23. But you can clearly see that this is, it's actually a handheld shot, but it's very, very stable. So you can see that there's a fairly drastic difference. Kind of interestingly, the S23 Ultra wanted to expose this scene relatively dark, and you can see that the way I exposed it, obviously you do get, you know, full manual control on the a7S III. This is kind of much closer to kind of true life that it would actually be. Another quick note is I've had to conform some of the frame rates and speeds to fit inside a 25 frames per second timeline. I've noted the speeds on the screen whenever I've done it. It won't change anything drastically, but yeah, just so you know. So yeah, another comparative here. I think again, one of the biggest differences is the exposure. Like, it is interesting that the S23 Ultra is making the scene relatively dark. Like, it was definitely seemingly a little bit brighter than this in terms of actual true to life. Another thing is just the sharpness, the kind of digital sharpness of the image, I think is far softer. You can kind of see it in the waves, the movement of the waves, particularly here. The a7S III is just much more soft, even though it's still a 4K resolution. Resolution is not everything, and it's definitely a more pleasing look for me on the a7S III. Obviously on the Samsung S23 Ultra we have to talk about the 8K video, an absolute headline feature, one which I wasn't super excited about, I have to admit, before getting the phone and testing it, but it is better than I thought it was going to be. I think it is actually a little bit softer than the main 4K mode. I think on face value, kind of viewing it on a 25 frames a second, like 4K timeline, like I'm doing here, I think I definitely take the a7S III footage every single time. I prefer the colors, I prefer the sharpness and softness. Things do get quite interesting though when we zoom into 300 or 400%. Obviously, you are starting to actually really see the benefit of those additional pixels. The a7S III maxes out at 4K resolution. You can't do any higher resolutions than that, whereas the 8K does allow you the flexibility to punch in just like this, and you can see that there is drastically more detail retained. Bear in mind that cropping is only obviously one solution. Normally I would kind of think about this in advance and actually zoom using a lens as opposed to cropping in post.
Particularly when we're talking about 8K video, but also this is of course relevant in the UHD modes. There is a significant difference between sharpness, softness, resolution, and also just kind of general quality of image.
So we use this as a little bit of a quickfire round. I'm also going to briefly talk about the lenses, because obviously a massive advantage of a more professional setup is the advantage of switching on interchangeable lenses. It allows you tons of flexibility, but the Samsung S23 Ultra has a really good selection of lenses. This is a really cool trend on smartphone cameras nowadays. Obviously multiple lenses, multiple options for us as creatives. But the thing is, lenses are not created equal. Like, as you can see this shot here comparing roughly a 77mm focal length on these two cameras, and I think this one is relatively comparable. Don't get me wrong, I still prefer the softness and the subtlety of the a7S III image, but you can have a look at this one here. This is obviously quite a beautiful shot, if I don't say so myself, on the a7S III. You get a lovely roll off. This is using the Tamron 50 to 400mm lens, and I think this is at a compression of 230mm roughly, and then comparing this to the Samsung shot, and you can see that there is just an enormous difference, to be honest, here. When you do start comparing a like-for-like lens at those further zoomed in focal ranges, this by far and away is where the professional cameras take a significant step up over the smartphones. The zoom performances on smartphones just aren't there for me. Here's another example looking at that roughly 77mm zoom, so the 3x lens. You can see that's just a kind of a standard shot of me. You can see the level of difference in shallow depth of field that you get on the Sony. It's like just significantly different. So basically everything about the shot just looks better on the Sony, as you can see.
So I do think it's really interesting when you compare the pictures side by side, just to see the different characteristics of each image. Next is dynamic range, and this is a super interesting one because each camera takes a different approach. Obviously on a smartphone, you're limited by the actual size of the sensor, like how big it can physically be. And that means that Samsung and other camera manufacturers are doing a lot of clever things to basically combine multiple layers of exposure inside the image that you're seeing.
This shot here is a perfect example of this. This is actually quite a tricky shot for a camera to reproduce because you've got a lot of shadow detail here in the pebbles on the beach. There's a lot of dark colors, and then you've obviously got this crisp, super bright highlights from the sun reflecting off the sea. So this is the 23 Ultra, and if we switch now to the Sony, you can actually see that the shot is overexposed here in the highlights. I got exposed for the pebbles, and really actually just relying on the camera's dynamic range is not enough. So the computational stacking for dynamic range to the S23 Ultra actually is superior in this particular example.
Obviously, we have to talk about portrait video.
Anyone who watches the channel a lot knows that I am really not a fan of portrait mode and certainly portrait video, cinematic video, this sort of style of like fake background blur. You're looking at the S23 Ultra footage right now, and I think you can already see like there's bits on the hat which it just doesn't know whether to focus on or not. I think this is a relatively okay portrait mode feature. I think actually Apple is quite a bit of the way ahead in terms of cinematic mode. Then if you just go over to the professional camera, like this is what it should look like. Like it's the blur is far more realistic. Everything looks far more natural. This is obviously the wide on the 1x, but if we switch over to the 3x, it's even more pronounced for me here. And you can see that actually, personally, I think the blur is getting worse, not better. Obviously, it looks more blurry, but then it's just immediately obvious that like certain bits of the hat are out of focus and stuff like that. And here, just so we have it, this is the Sony a7S III version of that same shot, far more blurry, far more natural, as you would get naturally more compression, and obviously everything that's in focus that should be in focus because it's proper optical focusing. Lots of people enjoy shooting slow-mo on their phone, so let's briefly talk about that as well. Sadly, on the S23 Ultra, I could only work out that you get slow motion shooting with the 1x lens. If anyone knows that to be different, correct me in the comments down below, because I kind of find that surprising that you can't shoot any form of slow motion other than like the main 1x lens. But you can see that this is the slow motion option. The standard slow motion shoots in 1080p and it goes up to 240 frames per second. But you do have the option to shoot super slow motion that goes to 960 frames per second, which is significantly better than the a7S III, of course, which caps out at, I believe, 240 frames per second at 1080 as well. Whilst these numbers might be similar, the difference in footage is rather kind of quite astounding, to be honest. Obviously on the a7S III, you can shoot in 4K at 120 frames a second, and then shoot that 240 frames a second at 1080. The footage is significantly better, and of course, obviously, you have the option to shoot at further zoomed in focal ranges. Of course you do, because it's just optical performance. And as you can see, this looks just like super nice on the a7S III.
Something which the Sony a7S III allows you to do is shoot in something called a log format. And what this means is you're actually shooting in a very flat, very controlled picture profile on your footage. And what this allows you to do later is capture as much dynamic range as possible within that file. And then you're able to use this data to grade out the image how you want it to look. On the Samsung, you're kind of stuck with what you get is what you get. There are, of course, slightly more professional apps and settings that you can choose on the Samsung S23 Ultra, but it's not going to be an accurate representation of a proper log format. You can see how much creative control I'm able to get in the grade of this Sony a7S III footage, and this just cannot be replicated on a smartphone.
Obviously, the Sony a7S III has been killing it during this comparison, but obviously it's not a super fair equivalent test. Somewhere where the S23 Ultra does absolutely insanely is its stabilization performance. And this is an area where smartphones are significantly better than standard cameras. So I've done 4 comparisons here. I've shot basically kind of running over the pebbles, as you can see. I shot in standard stabilization on both the camera and then active stabilization on the camera. And then I did sort of steady mode, like standard image stabilization on the S23 Ultra, and then also super steady on the S23 Ultra as well. The S23 Ultra was overwhelmingly impressive. I mean, you basically wouldn't ever use the A7S III footage here. You can clearly see that it's just like kind of not really usable. Even in the active mode, I have to admit, you're probably not going to want to use this footage. The stabilization standard on the S23 Ultra was really, really fantastic. And then absolutely crazy in super steady mode. Like, honestly, look at this. Like, obviously you can see a little bit of jitter from my footsteps, but I basically essentially like sprinting on these pebbles. You can see like how rough the A7S III footage is here. Like, that's because I'm moving an absolute ton. Like, very, very impressive stabilization performance on the S23 Ultra.
I think the overall takeaway from this video, to be honest, is like if you're comparing this image compared to this image, you can clearly see that there's just a significant difference. Like, the Sony allows me so much more creative control than you can kind of possibly ever get on a smartphone. Is why continually professionals are going to choose mirrorless bodies or even, cinema camera bodies to allow them to do their work. And this isn't to take anything away. There are times where shooting on a phone is unbelievably convenient, far more convenient than a professional camera. And it's also far easier to just like get your phone out, expose for a scene. You can do that straight away on a smartphone, and you really can't on the A7S III. So for any hobbyists out there, are you going to buy a slightly more professional camera? And for any professionals, are you going to throw your professional camera away?